The notice was nailed to her door with a single, brutal 10-penny nail, a fresh wound in the sun-bleached pine. It gave Abigail Finch precisely 72 hours to vacate the 640-acre ranch she and her late husband had built from dust and prayer. The Great Western Expansion Syndicate, a name she knew only from whispers and the masthead of the Denver newspaper, had acquired the land. A clause in the original 1872 homestead grant, something called the Mineral Rights Supremacy Covenant, had been invoked. The paper felt like a death sentence, cold and official. Her husband, Thomas, had been dead for 6 months, the victim of a fever that had swept through the valley, leaving Abigail with only their German shepherd, Kaiser, and a mortgage payment she couldn't possibly make. Now, she didn't even have that. The syndicate wasn't offering a buyout, they were executing a legal maneuver, clean and lethal. Her options were a stark and terrifying void. Stay and be removed by the sheriff, or run with whatever she could carry. For 2 days, she was paralyzed by a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight pinning her to the floorboards of her own home. On the 3rd morning, with the sun barely cresting the sawtooth peaks to the east, she moved. Kaiser watched, whining softly, as she packed a single trunk with Thomas's survey maps, her sewing kit, 3 changes of clothes, and the heavy family Bible. She sold their 4 remaining cattle and 2 horses to a neighboring rancher for a galling sum, $90, a fraction of their worth, but it was cash, and cash was survival. With the syndicate's deadline just hours away, she rode their last old mule into the dusty outpost of Redemption, a town that had long forgotten its name. The land agent, a man with sweat stains wringing the collar of his shirt, barely looked up. He had one property in her price range. A hunter's cabin, he called it. 1.5 acres deep in the Blackwood Forest, 20 miles north. The deed was questionable, the location remote to the point of being forgotten. The price was $45. It was a place to disappear. A place to hide from the ghost of her life. As she signed the flimsy paper, the agent mentioned the previous owner had died there a decade ago. Some old recluse, he'd mumbled. Folks said he was paranoid. Kept to himself until he just stopped. Abigail didn't care. She took the deed, the remaining $45 feeling like a pathetic fortune in her pocket, and turned toward the forest. She was no longer a rancher's wife. She was a refugee, running toward a darkness she could only pray was empty. The journey into the Blackwood Forest was a descent. The wide, sunlit plains of her former life gave way to a claustrophobic canopy of pine and fir that blotted out the sky. The air grew damp and heavy with the smell of rotten old growth. After 10 miles, the wagon trail dissolved into a faint deer path that Abigail and Kaiser followed with grim determination. She led the mule, its breath pluming in the unnaturally cool air, her hand resting on Kaiser's thick fur for a comfort that felt increasingly fragile. The cabin, when they finally found it, was less a dwelling and more a wound in the landscape. It was a single room, no more than 250 square feet, built of mud-chinked logs that had gone grey and begun to sag. The roof, a patchwork of sod and rotted shingles, had a brutal gash on one side where a fallen branch had punched through. A single grimy window stared out like a cataract-clouded eye. Despair, cold and sharp, pierced through the numbness that had protected Abigail for 3 days. This was not a home, it was a tomb. She tethered the mule, pushed open the groaning door, and was met with a blast of stale air and the thick, musty scent of decay. The interior was a disaster of abandoned life. A rusted stove, a broken cot, and a thick layer of dust, leaves, and animal droppings covered everything. For a full hour, she simply stood in the doorway, unable to move, the $45 in her pocket feeling like the price of her own burial. It was Kaiser who broke the spell. The dog, after a thorough and agitated sniffing of the cabin's perimeter, began to pace obsessively in front of the hearth, a crude construction of river stones and crumbling mortar. He whined, a low, insistent sound, and began scratching at one particular stone near the base, his claws making a sharp, grating sound against the rock. Abigail, exhausted and emotionally flayed, tried to call him off. "Kaiser, leave it," she commanded, her voice thin and reedy. But he wouldn't stop. He grew more frantic, digging with a purpose that was unnerving. He would scratch, then look back at her, his intelligent eyes burning with an urgency she couldn't ignore. There was no fireplace screen, just the soot-blackened stones. Something about the dog's fixation, so specific and unwavering, finally penetrated her wall of misery. It was a single, discordant note in the symphony of her ruin. Abigail knelt on the filthy floorboards, her knees protesting as she examined the stone Kaiser had singled out. It was a large, flat river rock, no different from the others at first glance. But as she ran her fingers along its edges, she felt it. A slight give. A subtle looseness the others lacked. Using the tip of the small blade from her pocket knife, she scraped away years of hardened soot and grime from the mortar seam. The mortar here was different, darker, with a slightly grittier texture, as if it had been applied much later than the surrounding masonry. It took her 20 minutes of meticulous, painstaking work, her knuckles scraping against the rough stone. Finally, with a small grunt of effort, she wedged the blade deep into the seam and pried. The stone didn't just move, it pivoted inward with a soft, grinding sound, revealing a dark, square cavity. Inside was not a box or a bag of coins, but a small, rust-pitted iron lever set flush against the back of the hearth. Her heart began a low, heavy drum against her ribs. This was not an accident. This was deliberate. This was a secret. With a deep breath, she reached into the darkness, her fingers closing around the cold, smooth metal of the lever. It was stiff, resisting her pull. She braced herself, planting her feet on the uneven floor, and threw her entire weight into it. A deep, resonant clunk echoed from somewhere beneath her feet, the sound traveling through the very foundation of the cabin. Kaiser barked once, a sharp, explosive sound. Abigail scrambled back, her eyes scanning the floor. Nothing had changed. Then she saw it. A faint, perfectly straight line in the dirt and grime near the center of the room, a line that had been invisible moments before. It formed a perfect 3-foot square. She grabbed the splintered handle of a forgotten broom and swept furiously, clearing away the thick layer of filth. There, set into the rough-hewn floorboards, was a trapdoor. It was not made of wood, but of solid iron, its surface pitted with age. A simple recessed ring served as a handle. It took all her strength, her muscles screaming in protest, to lift it. The hinges shrieked as if in pain, and the heavy iron door swung open, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down into absolute blackness. A wave of cold, subterranean air washed over her, smelling of damp earth and something else. Something metallic. She retrieved the lantern from her mule's pack, lit the wick, and descended into the unknown. The stone steps led to a small, brick-lined cellar, no larger than a closet. And set into the far wall, dominating the space, was a vault. It was an old model, a heavy iron box made by the Harrington Safe and Lock Company of St. Louis, its black paint peeling to reveal the raw metal beneath. A single, complex dial, marked with letters instead of numbers, sat in the center of the door. This cabin hadn't been a hunter's retreat. It had been a fortress. The air in the cellar was thick and still, the lantern flame barely flickering. The Harrington vault was an imposing, silent sentinel, its dial a cryptic challenge. There was no keyhole, only the alphabet wheel. Abigail ran her hand over the cold steel, a tremor of mingled fear and fascination running up her arm. Who was the paranoid recluse who had installed such a thing in a forgotten cabin in the middle of nowhere? She spent the first hour trying logical combinations, the previous owner's name, if she knew it, the town's name, anything she could think of. Nothing worked. The dial remained stubbornly locked. Defeated, she returned to the cabin above, the open trapdoor gaping more in the center of her new, miserable reality. She needed to think. She needed to understand the man who built this. Rummaging through the debris, she found a small, water-damaged crate tucked under the broken cot. Inside, beneath a layer of moldy rags, were 3 books, a well-thumbed copy of Shakespeare's tragedies, a book on celestial navigation, and a single, slim volume bound in black leather. It was a ledger. She took it to the sliver of light offered by the dirty window and opened it. The first page read, in a precise, almost mechanical script, Alastair Croft, Personal Accounts, commenced January 1870. The pages were filled with meticulous entries, detailing the cost of flour, nails, lamp oil, and ammunition. It was the painfully ordinary accounting of a man living alone. But as she turned the pages, the entries grew stranger. Interspersed with notes on crop prices were complex mathematical formulas and what looked like astrological charts. And then, on a page dated March 1875, she found it. A list of expenses under the heading, Syndicate Business. Her breath caught in her throat. The Great Western Expansion Syndicate. Her enemy. The name was there, in black and white, in the hand of the man who had lived and died in this very room. She read on, her mind racing. The ledger detailed payments for land surveys, legal filings, and travel expenses to Denver. Alastair Croft had not been a simple recluse, he had been an employee. A bookkeeper, it seemed, for the very entity that had just destroyed her life. This cabin wasn't a hideout from the world, it was a hideout from his employers. The retroactive refrain was brutal. The paranoid old man wasn't paranoid, he was terrified. He was hiding something. Abigail's gaze fell back to the open trapdoor. The combination wasn't a word. It was a system. She went back to the ledger, scanning the pages, not for what they said, but for their structure. She noticed Croft had a habit of circling the first letter of the first entry of each month. J, F, M, A, M. It was too simple. She rushed back down the steps. Her hand shaking, she turned the dial. J-N-U-A-R-Y. Nothing. F-E-B-R-U-A-R-Y. Nothing. She tried another pattern, the name of a stock that showed a sudden spike in value. GWES. Nothing. Then she saw it, in the margin of a page detailing a massive land purchase. A quote from Hamlet, one of the books in the crate, the readiness is all. She spun the dial. THEREADINESSISALL. With a final, satisfying thunk, the tumblers aligned. The handle turned. The heavy vault door swung open. Inside, there was no gold. No cash. Just more ledgers. Dozens of them, stacked neatly, filling the small space. The sight of the ledgers was, at first, a crushing disappointment. Abigail had braced herself for a life-altering fortune, a treasure that would allow her to vanish and start anew. Instead, she found paper. An archive of brittle, leather-bound books, each spine meticulously labeled with a year, from 1868 to 1878. This was not a treasure, it was a library of secrets. She carried the first volume, marked at 1868, up into the dim light of the cabin. It was heavier than Alastair Croft's personal accounts, its pages filled with the same precise, controlled script, but this was not about the price of flour. This was the birth of the Great Western Expansion Syndicate. It detailed initial investments, the names of the founding partners, Franklin Wallace's name was at the top of the list, and the acquisition of their first parcels of land. It was all clinically recorded, a sterile history of commerce. But Abigail was no longer just a grieving widow. The act of opening the vault had changed her. She was an investigator now, driven by a cold, burgeoning obsession. She retrieved her own trunk, pulling out the thick roll of survey maps and deeds Thomas had kept. He had been a meticulous man himself, a former surveyor who trusted paper and ink more than spoken words. For the next 3 days, Abigail lived in a world of numbers and lines. She barely ate, subsisting on the last of her dry goods, a pot of coffee perpetually brewing on the rusted stove. Kaiser lay by the door, a silent, watchful guardian. She spread Thomas's map of their valley on the floor, its familiar creeks and ridges a painful reminder of her loss. Then, she began the painstaking work of cross-referencing the syndicate's ledgers with her husband's records. It was on the second night, her eyes burning from the lantern light, that she found the first major discrepancy. The ledger for 1872 detailed the survey of the land that would become her ranch. But the coordinates and boundary markers listed in the syndicate's book did not match the ones on the official deed filed with the county, the deed Thomas had a copy of. The syndicate's internal record showed their claim extending 80 feet further south, encompassing the entirety of Whisper Creek. The official record stopped short of it. Her husband had complained about that survey for years. "It's off," he would say, tapping the map. The federal surveyor cut the corner. Cheated us of the creek by 80 feet. Everyone had told him he was wrong, that it was a trivial matter. But it wasn't. According to a note in the ledger margin, Whisper Creek was a key access point for future mineral exploration. The syndicate had intentionally misfiled a fraudulent survey to avoid alerting the original homesteaders to the land's true value. A flicker of memory ignited in her mind. The deed to this very cabin. The land agent had called it questionable. She unrolled the brittle document. The description was bizarrely specific. It described the 1.5-acre plot, but for the cabin itself, it listed the dimensions of the stone foundation, 15 feet by 25 feet. But the cabin was not 25 feet long. She had paced it herself. It was a simple rectangle, roughly 15 feet by 17 feet. There were 8 feet missing. A phantom 8 feet, recorded on a legal document, but absent in reality. The spatial mystery clicked into place with sickening clarity. The cabin wasn't just built on a foundation, part of the foundation was built around something else. The realization was a jolt of ice water. The missing 8 feet of the foundation weren't missing at all. They were just hidden. Abigail stood outside the cabin, the morning light filtering through the dense pines, and studied its construction. On the north side, the stone foundation rose about 2 feet from the ground before the log walls began. The wall was a seamless structure of wood and mud chinking. But the foundation beneath it, she paced it off. 15 feet wide. 17 feet long. Then, at the back, the stone foundation continued for another 8 feet, disappearing into the packed earth of the hillside the cabin was built against. There was no corresponding structure on top of it. It was a solid block, a stone plinth attached to the cabin for no logical reason. Alastair Croft hadn't just built a vault, he had built a tomb. And the vault wasn't meant to hold the treasure, it was meant to hold the key. She returned to the ledgers, her search now guided by a terrifying new hypothesis. She found what she was looking for in a volume from 1874, under a section titled, Contingencies. It was a single, cryptic line, primary account secured against discovery. See Protocol 11, Geologic Safeguarding. Geologic safeguarding. He hadn't buried the secret, he had encased it in stone. The work was brutal. The only tools left in the cabin were a rusted pickaxe and a heavy sledgehammer, their wooden handles dry and splintered. Her hands, soft from years of sewing and kneading dough, were raw and blistered within the first hour. She started at the top of the foundation's phantom section, swinging the sledgehammer with all her might. The jarring impact shot up her arms, but the stone held firm. This was not a simple wall, it was a carefully constructed sarcophagus of river stone and dense, poured concrete, a material she'd only seen used in the foundations of city banks. For 2 solid days, she hammered. Kaiser lay nearby, whining with a low, anxious hum, as if sensing the violation she was committing. Dust and sweat caked her face. Her muscles screamed, a constant, fiery agony. But the cold fury that had been building inside her was a more potent fuel than food or rest. This was a penance. This was an excavation. On the evening of the second day, the sledgehammer finally broke through. With a sickening crunch, the head punched through the outer layer of stone and met a void. A small one. Working frantically now, she used the pickaxe to widen the hole, pulling away chunks of concrete and stone. Inside, it was not a room. It was a small, hollow cavity, barely 2 feet wide. And within that cavity lay a long, cylindrical object wrapped in thick, black oilcloth and sealed with wax. It was impossibly heavy. She dragged it out into the waning light. Her hands trembled as she peeled away the stiff, sticky layers of oilcloth. Inside was not another ledger. It was the ledger. The phantom ledger. The one Alastair Croft had only hinted at. And beneath it, wrapped in a separate oilcloth, lay a tarnished silver locket. She opened the ledger. The first page was not an accounting of funds. It was a list of names under a stark, chilling heading, Injustices to be reconciled. The pages of the phantom ledger did not feel like paper, they felt like skin. The ink, a deep, unfaded black, detailed a campaign of systematic evil that made the financial fraud in the other books seem trivial. Alastair Croft, in his meticulous, obsessive script, had documented everything. He had been the syndicate's first and most trusted accountant, the architect of their financial empire, and his conscience had eventually, lethally, rebelled. The ledger was his confession and his indictment. It detailed the true origin of the Great Western Expansion Syndicate's wealth. They hadn't just bought land, they had stolen it. The book listed dozens of homesteaders, families who had held original federal land grants from the 1860s, who had been systematically erased. Their claims were voided through fraudulent paperwork, their wells poisoned, their livestock driven off. When intimidation failed, the syndicate employed what Croft termed final resolutions. He had recorded the dates, the locations, and the names of the men hired to ensure homesteaders simply disappeared. The list of victims was a roll call of the forgotten dead. And next to 3 of the names, Croft had made a small, chilling notation, order given by F. W. personally. F. W. Franklin Wallace. The polished, untouchable president of the syndicate. He had not just profited from the crimes, he had ordered them. The ledger was a weapon of devastating power. But it was one woman's word, holding a dead man's book, against a powerful and ruthless organization. It wasn't enough. She then turned her attention to the silver locket. It was heavy, tarnished with age. When she pried it open, she found no portrait inside. Instead, etched into the silver on one side was a name, Anna Marie Jensen, and a date, June 12, 1871. On the other side was a single, tiny, pressed wildflower. She scanned the phantom ledger for the name. Anna Marie Jensen. Her name was there, next to her husband, Peter Jensen. They had owned a small farmstead 200 miles to the east, land that was now the site of a major syndicate rail depot. The entry for June 12, 1871 read, Jensen resolution executed. F. W. on site. Complication resolved. Complication. The word was so sterile, so inhuman. Anna Marie Jensen was not a complication, she was a person who had loved wildflowers. The locket was not a memento, it was evidence. A piece of a victim, kept by a repentant monster. Abigail knew she could not do this alone. The local sheriff was a non-starter, the ledgers listed his name under regional inducement. She needed a different kind of weapon. A legal one. Packing the phantom ledger, the locket, and 2 of the most incriminating financial books, she left the cabin. She tacked a note to the door, gone to visit family. Back in 2 weeks. She filled a satchel with the last of her food, saddled the mule, and with Kaiser trotting grimly beside her, she set off not for the nearest town, but for the territorial capital of Durango, a 3-day ride away. She was no longer running from her past. She was marching toward a reckoning. Durango was a city of brick and smoke, the raw ambition of the West hardening into permanence. It stank of money, coal, and horses. Abigail, in her dusty, worn dress, felt like a ghost haunting a feast. She had a name, gleaned from a bitter conversation she'd overheard years ago between 2 ranchers who'd lost their water rights to a mining company. The name was Horace Bell. The ranchers had called him a drunken bulldog and a lost-cause lawyer, which was exactly what Abigail was looking for. She found his office on a dingy side street, above a saloon. The sign on the door just said H. Bell, attorney at law, the paint flaking away like sunburnt skin. The office was a single room overflowing with teetering stacks of legal books, yellowed case files, and empty whiskey bottles. Horace Bell himself looked like he had been assembled from spare parts of the room. He was a mountain of a man in a rumpled suit, with a great, stained beard and weary eyes that had seen too much of the world's casual cruelty. He was nursing a glass of amber liquid when she walked in, Kaiser's presence earning a barely perceptible lift of an eyebrow. "If you're here about a divorce, the answer is no," he grumbled, his voice a low gravelly rumble. "If you've been cheated at cards, the answer is also no. If the railroad killed your cow, take the $5 they offer you." Abigail stood her ground. "I'm here about the Great Western Expansion Syndicate," she said, her voice clear and steady. For the first time, Bell gave her his full attention. He put his glass down. Lady, that's not a cow. That's a dragon. And I don't slay dragons anymore. They have better lawyers than I have years left to live. Whatever they did to you, you can't win. He turned back to his desk, a clear dismissal. Abigail didn't move. She walked to his cluttered desk, cleared a small space, and laid down the phantom ledger. She opened it to the page listing the murdered homesteaders. Then, beside it, she placed the silver locket. Their president, Franklin Wallace, personally ordered the murder of at least 3 people, including a woman named Anna Marie Jensen on June 12, 1871. This was her locket. Bell stared at the ledger, then at the locket. He picked up the small silver object, his large, clumsy-looking fingers surprisingly gentle. He read the inscription. He then pulled a pair of spectacles from his pocket and began to read the ledger page. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. He read for a full 10 minutes, his breathing the only sound. The cynical, world-weary mask fell away, replaced by an expression of intense, almost predatory focus. He looked from the book to Abigail, and for the first time, she saw not a drunk, but the bulldog the ranchers had described. "You said Wallace was on site," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier theatricality. "Croft's notes are precise," Abigail replied. "He records Wallace's travel expenses, including a horse rental from a livery in Junction City for the week of the Jensen murder." Horace Bell slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. He walked to the window, staring down at the bustling street below. "For 20 years, I've been fighting these bastards one case at a time, and all I've done is slow them down. I've never had the map to their treasure room." He turned back to her, a grim, terrifying smile spreading across his face. "This isn't a map, Mrs. Finch. This is the key. Tell me everything. Start from the nail in your door." The plan Horace Bell devised was not one of frontal assault, but of meticulous, legal strangulation. "You don't fight a dragon with a sword," he'd explained, pacing his cluttered office. "You poison its water. You cut off its food. You use its own weight against it until it collapses." For 2 weeks, they worked. Abigail's clear memory and Thomas's maps, combined with Croft's ledgers, provided the ammunition. Horace provided the legal cannon. He didn't file a lawsuit against the syndicate. Instead, he drafted a series of quiet, devastating injunctions and liens based on obscure federal land statutes that Croft had, ironically, documented in his notes. Using the phantom ledger, Horace identified 3 other families, descendants of the original homesteaders who had been swindled but not murdered, who still lived in the territory. He traveled to them, presented the evidence, and had them sign on as co-plaintiffs. The case was no longer one woman's revenge, it was a class-action ghost story. The first shot was an injunction filed not in Durango, but with a federal judge in Santa Fe, citing the 1866 Federal Mineral Rights Act, a law designed to protect original prospectors, which Horace argued applied to the homesteaders. The injunction froze all new mining and rail development in a 500,000-acre swath of the syndicate's territory. The second shot was a lien placed against the syndicate's Denver headquarters, based on the provable, decades-old debt owed to the estates of the swindled families, a debt Horace calculated, with punitive interest, to be $12 million. As Horace predicted, this brought the dragon out of its lair. Franklin Wallace arrived from Denver on a private rail car, a man accustomed to swatting away problems with a checkbook or a threat. The meeting was held in Horace's office. Wallace was exactly as Abigail had imagined, impeccably dressed, radiating an aura of expensive, unshakable confidence. He did not acknowledge Abigail, directing all his comments to Horace. "Mr. Bell," Wallace began, his voice smooth as polished marble. "This is a clumsy and expensive piece of theater. Name your price. And your clients. We can make this nuisance disappear." Horace leaned back in his chair. "The price, Mr. Wallace, is the full and fair market value of every acre of land your syndicate has acquired through fraudulent means since 1868, plus punitive damages, to be paid to the estates of the original owners. We can start the accounting at around $20 million. Wallace laughed, a short, sharp bark. "You're insane." He then turned his cold gaze on Abigail. "Mrs. Finch. You have something that doesn't belong to you. A cabin. Some books. I suggest you return them. My associates can be very persuasive when it comes to retrieving stolen property. The threat hung in the air, thick and oily. Abigail met his gaze. The only thing I have that doesn't belong to me, Mr. Wallace, is a locket. It belonged to Anna Marie Jensen. The name, spoken aloud, was a physical blow. A flicker of something, not fear, but annoyance, the irritation of a forgotten chore, crossed Wallace's face. He stood up. You've made a grave error, both of you. He left. That night, 2 men on horseback rode out towards the Blackwood forest. They found the cabin. They found the note on the door. They kicked it in, finding the place empty except for the gaping hole in the foundation and the open, empty vault. They were looking in the wrong place. The real trap had already been sprung. The morning after Wallace's visit, a United States Marshal stepped off the 8:15 train from Santa Fe. He was not a local lawman on the syndicate's payroll. He was a federal officer, dispatched by the judge who had received Horace's injunction. In his possession was a warrant, not for fraud, but for the arrest of Franklin Wallace on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder. Horace had deliberately held back the final, lethal card. While Wallace's men were searching the empty cabin, Horace and the marshal were in the Durango Telegraph office, wiring statements and evidence summaries to the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. The Phantom Ledger was no longer a single book in a dusty office, it was a federal case. The marshal, flanked by 2 deputies, walked into the lobby of the Grand Imperial Hotel where Wallace was having breakfast. They arrested him quietly, without fanfare. The president of the Great Western Expansion Syndicate was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. The news spread like a wildfire. The syndicate, built on a foundation of secrets and intimidation, could not withstand the sunlight. The arrest of its president triggered a panic among its investors. The liens Horace had filed acted like a poison pill, paralyzing the company's assets. Within a month, the syndicate was bankrupt, its vast holdings falling under the control of a federal receiver. The trial of Franklin Wallace was the sensation of the decade. Horace Bell, the drunken bulldog, was magnificent. He systematically dismantled the syndicate's defense, using Alastair Croft's meticulous records to build an unshakable fortress of facts. He put the descendants of the swindled families on the stand. He presented the fraudulent surveys, the cookbooks, the records of intimidation. The final piece of evidence was the silver locket. When he presented it to the jury, describing the life of Anna Marie Jensen and reading the cold, corporate entry that documented her resolution, the courtroom was utterly silent. Franklin Wallace was found guilty of conspiracy and 3 counts of murder. He was sentenced to hang, a sentence that was carried out 6 months later. Abigail Finch did not get her old ranch back. The federal government took possession of all syndicate lands. But Horace, in a brilliant legal maneuver, successfully argued that under the terms of the original, valid land grants, the mineral rights belonged to the estates of the homesteaders. Abigail's 640 acres sat atop one of the richest silver veins in the territory. Her settlement from the federal government was not $90, but $200,000. It was a fortune beyond her wildest imagination. But she did not disappear. She stayed in Durango. With her newfound wealth, she established the Horace Bell Foundation for Land Rights, a legal aid society dedicated to providing legal counsel to homesteaders and small ranchers fighting against powerful corporate interests. She bought Horace a new suit and funded his office with a permanent staff. The final scene of this brutal chapter unfolded a year later. Abigail returned to the cabin in the Blackwood forest. It was no longer a place of despair. She had hired men to repair the roof, install new windows, and build a proper porch. The hole in the foundation was filled, the vault cellar sealed forever. She stood on the porch, Kaiser resting his head on her lap, and looked out at the silent, watchful trees. The forest was no longer a hiding place. It was a monument. A testament to the fact that sometimes, the deepest wounds can become the most powerful weapons, and that a single, stubborn voice, armed with the truth, can bring a dragon crashing down from the sky.